Good. My name is Jim Whitty. I am director of the Institute for Immigration Research here at George Mason. And we have been as an institute for 12 years. And when I was first asked to do this in 2012, I said, it's okay. You know, we just passed an immigration bill in the Senate, and my job is done. 12 years later, it's not done. And so the reason Ray is here, I will explain a little bit, is I was watching my favorite late-night TV show, Jim Lokay, who is a Fox 5 correspondent, and he was interviewing Ray about his new book, We Are Home, and I thought, wow, good book. And so I sent Ray an email. We had never met before, and said, you know, would you be willing to come to George Mason and give a talk about your book? And he said, absolutely. I will not talk about your Zoom background, which is the Zoom background you would expect from someone who is a radio personality. Ray has worked for NPR for decades. And I was thinking, you know, I grew up listening to Ray. Ray and I are the same age. But he was always a sort of presence on National Public Radio. And so it's a real treat to have you here today, talk about your book, and get some questions from the audience. And, you know, we did this in 2016 after the election, and thought this would be a good way to get people to think about the implications of the election for immigration going forward. And now, 8 years later, we're in the same place. So I'm handing it over to you, Ray.
Great. Well, good to see you all. And Jim, thanks for inviting me. During the last 3 months of this campaign, there were many moments where it's really no exaggeration to say my heart sank as I watched the political discourse in this country over immigration, such as it is, descend into meaninglessness. Yes, there were problems at the border, but nothing that a globe-straddling superpower, the most powerful nation on earth, shouldn't have been able to handle. Yes, a tiny percentage of the people who had come through and asked to be let in, and a tiny percentage of the people who snuck in, despite the best efforts of an enormous, well-funded, well-supplied force to intercept them, were criminals. And yes, as we heard the scary music in the background, a lot of the people who headed to America were so-called military-aged males. I kept hearing that phrase repeated over and over again, military-aged males. Well, guess what? A tiny percentage of any very large group of people are going to be criminals. And people who are rolling the dice and fleeing civil war, civic calamity, economic meltdown, are going to be heavily concentrated in the time of life of able-bodied men who hope to get work of any kind and send money home. Busboys are military-aged males. Dishwashers are heavily concentrated in the military age era of life. Landscapers are military-aged males. Dishwashers are military-aged males. Fruit pickers are heavily military-aged males. A roofer pounding shingles in the hot sun in a new subdivision outside Las Vegas or Phoenix or Atlanta is likely to be a military-aged male. It was repeated over and over again to create an atmosphere of threat, of conspiracy, of some outside force, and their plan to infiltrate a secret destabilizing army into the United States without firing a shot. The candidate of a major party called them vicious criminals, animals, vermin, said they were poisoning the blood of this country. And in response, his opponent said almost nothing. If you watched her stump speech in Arizona, in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in an election where one party tried to turn the whole country into a border state, the other major party candidate treated the issue like kryptonite, the only element that can hurt Superman, and said little unless she was forced to do so. It was an amazing failure of strategy, and we can talk more about that later. The book was begun after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, because I watched that rally that night and worried about what the long, snaking torchlight parade of aggrieved young white men, convinced that the government and other shadowy forces was engineering a demographic revolution in American life, I wondered whether that was much broader than that several thousand young men, much broader a sign of something going wrong in the country. But I knew that this was something that was not going to end well, and it hasn't. At least not in the animating concern of mine that the national discourse, the family argument, if you will, over immigration had gone wildly off track and was no longer tethered to the reality of who immigrants are, where they come from, what they contribute to the daily business of moving this big, complicated, clanking, noisy country of 335 million people forward day by day. Those chanting young men in Charlottesville, drawn to a heroic equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee, were fired up by the idea of the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement Manifesto, it's actually a fairly lengthy, turgid document, circulates in some of the most dark and fetid corners of the internet. It basically spells out the existence of a conspiracy backed by international Jewry to accelerate migration to the United States from developing countries in order to change the voting population of the U.S. and, more or less, deprive white men of their natural inheritance as the people who matter in American society. The world saw the spectacle of thousands of aggrieved young white men chanting, "You will not replace us," and "Jews will not replace us." Add to that elected officials, people of arguably high responsibility, like Steve King of Iowa, who told an interviewer, "You can't rebuild a civilization with other people's children." He speculated about ending birthright citizenship, something Stephen Miller, who we now know will be headed back to the White House as a senior policy advisor, has also been speculating about. And I felt that our never-ending family fight about who comes, under what rules, for what reasons, and what happens when they stay, had gotten badly, badly off track and needed a counter-argument. So I began writing an angry, tough, pointed book about white nationalism, about the elevation of the racial ideas of people like Steve Miller and Steve Bannon, and the senses which, in both our long-term and near-term history, these sentiments were deeply un-American, deeply detached from our history, and an attempt to stop an American future that was already on its way. The cake is already baked in demographic terms. And trying to stop the tide or stop the sun from rising in the east is futile and only will work to divide and agitate this country. My editor at Little Brown looked at the early chapters and said, "Look, I know why you're writing that book. I don't want that book. But these immigrants that you're talking to, that I'm finding in these chapters, they're great. Why don't you move them to the center of what you're doing and keep on going?" And he was right. if you want to reclaim the humanity that is at the beating heart of the American immigration story, you've got to make sure the people who are coming in are not details or stats or cardboard cutouts, but people. And he was right and I was wrong, and it's not easy for an author to say that about an editor. They're more often irritating than they are correct, but he was correct. That conceptual shift results in the book that I hope you'll read, and there couldn't be a better time, it seems, now that we know that Donald Trump is headed back to the White House, to make this argument, this counter-argument. There may be a range of different views, even in this room, about what to do now, how to fix or improve the system that allows people to move to the United States permanently. But no matter what your opinion is on how to move forward, I will point out that in modern America, there has never been a more stark choice on the subject of immigration than there was in this election just passed. You could look at 1988, 1992, 1996, 2000, 2008, any of those races, and the expectable outcomes in the presidential race if the other person had won. They would have yielded slightly different outcomes. Different means, different emphasis, different mechanics, but not really starkly different outcomes. Not different universes of choices, which is what we're talking about now. The world that is on tap, the world that will arrive on January 20th, is very different from the one that would have come here in January had Kamala Harris been standing on the west front of the Capitol and taking the oath of office instead of Donald Trump. If Al Gore had become president instead of George W. Bush, if John McCain had become president instead of Barack Obama, you know, there would have been slight differences. But this, what we've got coming, is a remarkable time. Now, I should point out that nativism is not new. It's very old. It's as old as immigration to the United States. The idea is simple, the way we look at it now, and because Americans are doomed not to know their own history, it's kind of ahistorical, the way we look at it now. We've got these aging photographs of beloved ancestors on mantelpieces all across the country, from all kinds of places. And those people, those grim, old-fashioned, dressed, sepia-tone photographs, those people we assumed would get the hang of being American and learn English and acculturate and assimilate and become us. It was never doubted. Even as you have to remember, and this is the part that we like to forget, that when your great-great-grandparents from Sweden or Bavaria or Sicily came, it was not assumed that they would get the hang of being us, that they would acculturate, that they would assimilate, that they would stop taking a newspaper that was in their home country language, that they would stop going to church where Mass or regular services were held in the language of their home country. It was doubted back then, but now assumed, that we always knew that Bubby and Zadie and Nonna and Nonno and Abuelo were all going to become Americans. They were all going to get the hang of it, no problem. But we take that ahistorical moment and then we flip it on its head in 2024 and assume that the newest generation of arrivals from China, India, Mexico, Senegal, and Syria will not become Americans. So we detach our own ancestors from history And then we detach today's immigrants from history, from the long line of people who have come from all kinds of places and just unremarkably become American. We Americans are lucky and also burdened by the fact that we don't remember or misremember our past. Some of you are old enough to remember the terrible civil wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and it was reported and written about at the time that they were still holding grudges about 14th and 15th century battles in places like Kosovo. We don't remember anything that happened in the 15th century, or the 16th or the 17th, or even the 20th in many cases. But history is still alive in a very dangerous way in many places in the world. But we have been here before. While it may be a valid historical conclusion, it's not necessarily a good roadmap for the future. Let me ask you, does that mean that we're obliged, that we're fated to do it all again? As if we're utterly unable to learn the lessons, ever, of our own history. We give newcomers a kind of ritual hazing at the front door. It's hard coming here from somewhere else in the world. Ask anybody who's done it. If the persistent suspicion, the mean speculations surrounding their habits, their attitudes, their willingness to live in a democracy is just replaying some tired old script from the Know-Nothing Party from the second half of the 19th century, does it do the newcomers among us? Does it do the wider polity of Americans any good to just fall back on this reflexive historical habit? And what is this term creeping into more and more of the immigration discourse? You can hear it from Tucker Carlson. You can hear it from J.D. Vance. Legacy Americans. Legacy Americans. Does that, in the long run, do us much good either? There is no such thing as a legacy American. And just the fact that people think so slows our journey to where we got to get to altogether. The ability to live and thrive in this country is not genetic. It's not passed down from one generation to another. In the bones. Take two people from my hometown, Brooklyn, New York. One is a newcomer to the city, living in one of the swell brownstone neighborhoods, a descendant of 19th century sod-busting Swedes who were given a farm by the federal government to help settle the Great Plains. After college, he moved east, unlike his ancestors who moved west, to New York City. And there he is in Brooklyn. The other, his neighbor, is a Chinese-American woman born in Brooklyn, whose parents came as children to New York City and is now raising her own children there. Which one of those two is a legacy American? Which one of those two has some sort of superior claim, some sort of inside track to being American, to thinking like an American, to having the instincts of someone growing up in a democracy? Does one of those two people have a more substantial, more authentic claim to a place in our society than another? It's heretical. It's un-American to think so. And during the pandemic, it played out on the streets of American cities, at supermarket checkout counters, in parking lots, people abusing East Asians as their anxieties over loss of income, over being forced to stay home, over their bored, restless kids unable to go to school, resulted in thousands of cases of lashing out and harassment and assault of people who looked Asian, as if they had something to do with a worldwide pandemic rolling around the globe and playing havoc with American life. So, back to Charlottesville. I felt sorry for and sorry about these young men for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the "you" in their chant that will not replace them, that's me. When they're chanting, "You will not replace us," they're talking about me and my wife and my kids. And these men who believe strongly that they are patriots think their own country, the country they purport to love, is a zero-sum game. A place where someone else's progress and productivity means there's less for them. That someone else getting ahead means they are somehow less likely to do so. It is a departure from centuries of what our patriots believed about this country, that the miracle of the place is that it is not a zero-sum game. I have no doubt that if I had begun to work the line of torchbearers, I've been a reporter for my whole adult life, so you have this privilege from having a press card in your pocket of just strolling up to people that you've never laid eyes on before and talking to them. It's one of the great superpowers that a reporter's press pass gives you. If I had started to work the line, doing quick interviews, a lot of their names would have been names like Clark and Smith and Jenkins from the British Isles. But also in that line, chanting "You will not replace us," would have been people named Vogel and O'Leary and Santella and Schneider and Grabowski. They themselves would be the descendants of people who came here and for a long time experienced the same kind of marginalization and exclusion because they weren't, strictly speaking, in the racial pseudoscience of the day, white people. Today, seeing themselves as powerful and inherently superior, but now a threatened majority of the country, their own understanding of America's past would neatly edit out the ways their own ancestors were allowed to become white in a sort of weird piece of sociological alchemy. They became white. And they were able to set aside what had been the identity they carried in the eyes of 19th and 20th century nativists. That Slavs and Celts and Italians, not good white stock from which to build a great nation. These young men have so little faith in America, have so little grasp of our history, that they believe the great transformation, the amazing metamorphosis that made Americans out of their own forebears, is something, it's a trick we can no longer master, that we can no longer repeat it with people named Lopez and Hernandez and Chen and Kim and Suleiman. Furthermore, in the uglier, deeper recesses of great replacement theory lurks that idea that powerful, moneyed elites are engineering this large-scale immigration to the U.S. in order to steal their inheritance. The birthright of these aggrieved white men is being engineered. This theft is being engineered by who? By Jewish forces, who secretly and not so secretly run the country and run the world. It is a deluded, hateful, cramped, mean, and dysfunctional belief to carry into the rest of this century. And believe me, if you build your entire idea about how to live in the society that starts at the front door of this building around those ideas, you are going to have a very uncomfortable remainder of the 21st century. Those fellows are going to be alive a lot longer than I am, and maybe they haven't looked around Virginia recently. Maybe they haven't looked around Courthouse Square and Falls Church and communities around here. Whether it's picking your strawberries or milking your cows or bussing your restaurant tables or pounding your roof shingles or inventing the future in Silicon Valley, pioneering approaches to cancer surgery in Chicago, or to birth defects in a human genome lab in Boston. Immigrants are part of the American story. They get done the work that we have to do as a people. They are us. And those fellas simply can't believe that they are us. They can't believe that they're part of the same polis with their fellow Virginians. As I mentioned in the opening paragraphs of the book, I wrote a lot of it while I was living in China, a country that has made very different choices about immigration. China's birth rate has cratered. The country is now losing population annually. Without policy changes, in coming decades, it will have severe troubles producing its food and manufactured goods and recruiting for the People's Liberation Army. One of the places I've talked about the differences between the U.S. and China in attitudes around immigration is China. And when I spoke a few months ago at the U.S. consulate in Shanghai, I said that U.S. attitudes toward immigration were very different from China's in a way that you could just see when you walked on the streets of any city in the two countries. And one Chinese attendee at the lecture doubted that that was true. She was very skeptical that Americans had a very different attitude toward immigrants from the one held by Chinese. I could only reply with a few quick data points. I talked about how my Shanghai neighbors, while I was living there, were very well aware, extremely well aware, that there was a foreigner living on the second floor rear apartment of 66 Ouyuan Lu. And that if I had lived there another 30 years, becoming fluent in Chinese, working in the local economy, I would have still been the foreigner on the second floor, no matter how long I lived there. No one would ever refer to me as Chinese, no matter how well I came to fit into the society. She eventually conceded that that much was true. Our, at first, reluctant, then begrudging, then serially repeated great talent as a people has been to gather in newcomers from everywhere and watch them become us. And no matter how aggrieved you are, young man, about a future where you will not be a member of a presumed majority, large and in charge of everything, this country will still essentially be itself. We have to work on that asymmetry, where they have trouble seeing me as a part of their America, and I have no problem seeing them in mine. One thing I write extensively about in the pages of the book is the way immigration is transforming the religious life of the country. For much of American history, the patterns of immigration acted as a proxy for race, and race acted as a proxy for religion. We did not have it in statute that we only wanted Christian immigrants, but by first putting out the welcome mat for, and then writing into practice and statute that we wanted European immigrants primarily, it was predictable that the United States would become a country of Christians, with a small scattering of Jews. Muslims and others were brought to the United States in the 19th century as property, forced into slavery in North America, forbidden from practicing their original religion, and eventually, in large numbers, converted to Christianity. So even as a nation of immigrants, this country, as late as 1965, was almost entirely Christian. World junking the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917 and the Chinese Exclusion Act and other restrictive laws, and getting rid of the 1924 quotas that favored Europe, and now began becoming home to more people from East and South Asia, from Africa and Latin America, and we remade the demographics of American religion in a few short years. Even as Americans of longer family history in this country were walking away from the religions of their forebears. So there are empty Lutheran churches all over the Dakotas and packed mosques in Brooklyn. As the number of unaffiliated have grown, so has the number of Hindus, the number of Muslims from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. As more and more immigrants begin or continue their families' American journeys, not in religious and ethnic ghettos in central cities, the way they did 125 years ago, but now increasingly in suburbs, beginning their American journeys in suburbs, will that glue of shared religious profession remain after one, after two, after three generations? In those same suburbs, gurdwaras, mosques, Buddhist temples, Spanish-speaking megachurches are joining the landscape along the suburban arterials, right along with First Presbyterian and First Baptist and giant non-denominational Protestant churches. One of the places I take the reader in We Are Home is to an enormous Hindu temple just outside Dallas. Another in a growing multinational immigrant Muslim congregation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And to a fascinating young Episcopal mission in Dearborn, Michigan, led by a Virginia Theological Seminary grad named Halim Shukair from Lebanon, who was asked by the Episcopal Bishop of Michigan to grow an Arabic-speaking congregation in a church whose foundation stone was laid by Mrs. Henry Ford, who could never have imagined an Arabic Episcopalian service going on in that church 70 years later. Father Halim leads a religiously diverse congregation drawn from Israel and Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. And while almost all his flock was raised as Christian, none were raised as Anglicans. So he's right now writing the first Arabic translation of the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, something Thomas Cranmer in the 16th century would have also had a hard time imagining. And in a very American move, he's adding an English summary to his sermon every week, because the young people who accompany their parents to church on Sunday have not mastered Arabic as well as their own parents. It's a new story and a very old American one at the same time. If, after I retire in the next few years, I could head to seminary for a graduate degree, I would want to watch closely what these newest Americans do. Will they, as they acculturate, as their tenures here in the U.S. lengthen, as their children reach adulthood and have their own children, become religiously more like their native-born neighbors, be increasingly unaffiliated, or remain somewhat distinct? Are they on a different timeline? Will they remain tied, in a sense, to their homelands by their congregational lives? That could mean that they disaffiliate at a similar level to native-born Americans, even as they carry a distinctive set of racial features and skin tones into the future, but do not carry their ancestral faith. Or it could mean, over time, converting to what seems to them to be a more American church, which is something we see a lot of American-born Latinos doing now. One of the people I profile in this book is a deacon in an Ethiopian church. His youngest congregants are no longer as familiar with the separate liturgical language spoken in Ethiopian churches, which is distinct from the language of daily life. It's called Giz. And he wonders, as they grow up and inevitably marry out, will they join similar but more American congregations that worship in English? Will they marry black Americans and become Baptist or AME congregants? A Hindu mother of 2 college-age sons in a coffee shop tells me both her sons will definitely marry in the faith. But even if they don't, she's confident they will remain Hindu. Her confidence is buoyed by the families she sees at Temple, with intermarried couples where both parents are encouraging their children in Hindu learning. Will a particularly American style of Islam grow in this country? One where more of the preaching and teaching goes on in English, even as Arabic prayer remains central. A few years ago, I spoke at the commencement of NOVA, Northern Virginia Community College. The president told me he had to learn by doing. Not to assume that every woman graduate crossing the stage to pick up her associate's diploma would shake his hand. He didn't want to commit a social infraction, but he also wanted to be friendly and welcoming. Some, wearing head covering, were happy to shake his hand. Still others, following the conservative tradition of their families, would not touch the hand of an adult male who was not a family member. And he realized it wasn't a big deal. It was just life in the 21st century in Northern Virginia. So he would smile as they were coming across the stage and say, "Do you shake hands?" And if they said yes, give him a big handshake while he's giving them their diploma. No problem. Life handled. Just a small adaptation to American life that really just took a second to negotiate. States in the 18th and 19th centuries were not immigrants, strictly speaking, at all. They were taken from Africa against their will and brought to this country with incalculable loss during the Atlantic crossing, with countless people dying and simply being thrown overboard, but those that made it to these shores were forced to work for the rest of their lives. The millions of black Americans who lived in this country were not even citizens until the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution. That terrible history does not dissuade Africans today. People I spoke to from Nigeria and Senegal and Ethiopia were very upfront about it. They knew there was a difficult racial history here, and yet they came anyway powered by optimism and confidence that the country had changed and that they would be okay. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think there's something very redemptive in that for people on both sides of that transaction. Add to the new African immigrants, people coming from other places in the diaspora, from Latin America and Europe. And today, 1 out of every 10 black people in America is an immigrant. And that is an astonishing thing. And 1 out of every 5 black people in America is either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant, which is astonishing given our history. Black Americans were the most uniformly native-born people in America apart from American Indians. If you were not white and not black, you could not naturalize, though. A lot of people don't know that slightly embarrassing part of our history. The 14th Amendment is very specific about who can become a citizen, and it was used as a cudgel to keep people from Asia from becoming citizens of the United States, until a young fella named Wong Kim Ark brought a suit against the United States after having been born in California and insisted that he was a citizen of the United States. Eventually, he wins his argument, and in the decision in Wong Kim Ark versus the United States, the principle of jus soli, that is, law of the soil, becomes American law, and if you are born here, you are a citizen. But that didn't make it possible for people not born here to naturalize. People like Bhagat Singh Thind, a university student in the Pacific Northwest, who enlisted in the U.S. Army during the First World War, in part because he was fond of this country and wanted to stay, in part because the law at the time said that if you enlisted in the Army, you could become a citizen. When Thind used the provision in the law that offered citizenship to foreign nationals, he was made a U.S. citizen, then had his U.S. citizenship rescinded by the Bureau of Naturalization. He applied again. Citizenship was granted again, and then taken away again. Thind fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, where he lost, and the majority opinion was written by an immigrant. A justice of the Supreme Court who was born in England. No problem becoming a citizen for that justice. Thind and his lawyers argued that the doughboy was a white man and fell inside the provision of the law that barred others from naturalizing. Thind didn't go into court saying that law is wrong. He just said, look, I'm a Northern Indian, so under you guys' rules, I'm an Aryan and thus a white man. The justices who ruled in this case said, well, technically you might be a white man, but we're going to rule on the basis of what the common man on the street would see you as if they saw you coming down the sidewalk. And if that's not white, you're not a citizen. To his credit, to his tremendous credit, even after he lost the case and remained in the United States and got a PhD and became a much loved teacher of religious studies, he kept at it, and finally, in the late 1930s, became a citizen of the United States and lived here to a ripe old age and died in the late 1960s. I find myself getting incredibly sentimental as I get older, and at the same time, hard-nosed and practical about all these things. In the final chapters of the book, I talk at length about American ideals, about acceptance and tolerance and belief in the future, and about the real situation we find ourselves in today, and the yawning chasm, the uncomfortable gap between the real and the ideal, about the real need for workers and children to keep this lumbering, clanking machinery of a continent-sized country moving forward, about the need to avoid the kind of intergenerational demographic anger and danger waiting in coming decades in China, in South Korea, in Russia, in Ukraine, where now the fertility rates are down below 1 child per woman of childbearing age. I want us to include a little thinking about social utility when it comes to immigration, about practical things, about who do we think is going to take care of the largest generation of old people in American history. In Japan, which I visited in April and takes very few immigrants, Japan makes it very hard to be an immigrant, very difficult to stay long-term. The fastest growing job for Japanese in their 60s and 70s is taking care of other Japanese in their 90s. Along with the calculations about alternative American futures, about the beautiful stories immigrants told me about becoming American and the things they learned along the way, we should be honest with ourselves about how the country is changing. Home-based elder care is a fast-growing industry because the number of people who need it is also growing fast. 14% of all the people living in the United States were born in another country. More than 50% of our home health care workers are immigrants. What does that mean? That means that many older Americans are going to spend a significant chunk of time of their lives with someone that they might not have even wanted to live next door to at another time in their life. That person will walk with them to prevent falls when they're outside, sort their pills, prepare their meals, help them bathe, learn their moods and quirks, help ease their decline, and cry at their funerals. Immigration will have a heavy impact on this most intimate, most family-like time of life, where we no longer assume that family members will perform those functions for elderly Americans. In old detective and crime dramas of the 30s and 40s, a suspect might be placed under police interrogation, or a person kidnapped by a criminal might hold out and refuse to give information the bad guy wants. And the detective or the criminal might give the same ominous warning. You've seen the black and white movies. We can make this easy, or we can make this hard. It's up to you. And really, I want to give America the same warning. We can make this easy, or we can make this really hard. And it doesn't have to be hard. Why would we want to make it hard if it doesn't have to be hard? But we're about to see, starting January 20th, just how hard we want to make it, if that's what we want. People tell pollsters they're ready to give a path to citizenship, to DACA recipients, to long-term undocumented residents, to their family members. And at the same time, as majorities of Americans tell pollsters they want to give the DACA kids a path to citizenship, they want family members to be naturalized, we elected the most anti-immigrant president in modern American history last week. Those things, two things, live very uncomfortably next to each other. But that's the situation we're facing right now. And I hope I've left enough time for some questions.
Thank you, Ray. All right, I'm going to ask the first question and then turn it over to the group. And it was prompted by what you just said. This afternoon, I spoke with a group of senior citizens. And I read them from your book, because they said, what do we do? The assignment they gave me when I was a little boy was to make sure this country's here for new families. That's what you're talking about. So how do we do it?
Well, I really fault our leaders on this one because they have vast resources at their disposal, bringing them information from the front lines of daily life in this country. They are very well aware of where in the country there are labor shortages, where in the country unemployment is high, where in the country new units of housing are being built and where they're not. They know all this stuff or can find it in an instant. If you are a president who's curious, you can pick up the phone, and believe me, there are people who in a matter of an hour or so will get you everything you want to know. They will not talk honestly to us about where things stand with both our own fertility challenges, the size of generational cohorts, the fact that when Social Security was instituted, there were 6 workers for every retired person, and when I retire next year, we're going to be on the road to 2.5 workers for every retired person. I feel like I should meet them personally, both the 2.5, to tell them to work very hard so I'll still have a Social Security check. That there are problems, right now in processing the people who want to come in here, who have tried to come in here, legally and illegally. We are right now in the midst of a global crisis of migration, refugees, people fleeing their homelands. Central Europe is filled with millions of Ukrainians who have fled bombed-out cities, places where the air raid sirens go off every night. Go to an elementary school in Poland and it's filled with Ukrainian kids. In Romania, even in Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, there are Ukrainian refugees. There are South Sudanese refugees in Sudan and Sudanese refugees in South Sudan. There are Somali refugees in Kenya. People fleeing the Congo into the Central African Republic. It is a worldwide problem. And did we really think one of the largest and the most wealthy and powerful and influential country on the globe was just going to sit on the sidelines while the poorest countries in the world dealt with this challenge? And we have to also, nudge people a little bit out of their comfort zones. People fall back on easy cliches like, well, yeah, you might have noticed that my name is Capodanno. Yeah, my great-grandparents came from Naples, but they followed the rules. They did it legally. That's always what comes at the end of that story. Yeah, my forebears are immigrants too, but they did it legally. What they don't tell you is that from the beginning of the 19th century until 1924, there were virtually no rules. It's easy to follow the rules when there are almost no rules. Can we be a little honest with ourselves? Right now, coming to the United States is difficult. If you try to get legal before you come, it can take 15 years. You can spend an era of your adult life, a big chunk of your adult life, trying to get into the United States. I think, as somebody from the outside of the system looking in, that if you make laws too hard to follow, people won't follow them. You with me on that? I mean, I think it's pretty simple and straightforward. I would not want all our rules to be like that, where you can just say, well, it's hard, and then you break the law. But it is ridiculously hard and complicated and expensive and time-consuming to come here legally. I was speaking to an Indian immigrant a couple of weeks ago, and he gave me this long, torturous story about how he was here on an H-1B, but then the employer that he was here with actually went out of business, disappeared, declared bankruptcy, and collapsed as a corporation. And from that moment, the clock starts ticking. You have 60 days to find a new employer who will sponsor you for an H-1B visa, or else you have to leave. The law says
illegal.
You have to leave. You'll be illegal. Luckily, he managed to find a smart lawyer who got him a visa, the same kind of visa that that Emily Watson gets when she wants to work in Hollywood to make a movie. The same kind of visa that
the O and the P visa.
Yeah, it's some sort of special talents thing, and so he's there on that kind of visa now. He's a writer, lives in Silicon Valley. But I said to him, well, gee, Pranav, don't you want to just become an LPR and get a green card and be here permanently? He says, oh, I would love to get a green card. But given the size of the annual quota for Indians, if I start my application process now, it will take 100 years. And I laughed. I said, oh, come on, you're exaggerating for emphasis. You're kidding. And he said, no. Given the number that they give out each year and the number of applicants there are, it will take me 100 years. So I said, well, how old are you? And he was 31. I said, well, it gives you something to live for.
Interviewed any unaccompanied immigrant minors or any climate refugees, and how those stories sort of fit with
I talked
some of the others you did talk
to several DACA recipients, but they weren't unaccompanied. Their parents brought them in as children. One is an EMT with the Houston Fire Department. And he came in at 7 years old, learned English very quickly, and it wasn't until he was sort of moving into his final years in high school that he realized the fix that he was in, because he couldn't go to a public college in Texas for Texan tuition. He would have had to pay international student tuition because he wasn't considered a resident of Texas, even though it was really the only place he knew. And it was DACA that really saved his bacon, because he wasn't able to get a driver's license and he wasn't able to go to a public college. Luckily, a coach was scouting high schools and picked him up to be on the cross-country team in this college. So he ran college track on an athletic scholarship and managed to finish a degree that way. And DACA helped him get both a taxpayer identification number and a driver's license, because otherwise, as an undocumented immigrant, a career as an EMT with an established fire department was impossible. So his life has been made possible by this, and at the same time, now that he's 31, he's kind of impatient to start the rest of his life. He's living in limbo, unable to do many of the things that even his colleagues at the Houston Fire Department consider just something natural and normal that they can do. One woman was smuggled over the border at 9 years old and is now a professor in California. What saved her adult life was the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which as a teenager gave her legal permanent residence. It never would have happened otherwise. And she credits that law with just making the life that she has now possible. A Salvadoran I spoke to was smuggled across the border as a 12-year-old by coyotes. During the Salvadoran Civil War, his father fled the country because he was on a hit list. Father couldn't return to El Salvador to get his son, so he had him smuggled over. And he is today the National Vice President of the Service Employees International Union. But when he graduated high school in D.C., he just went to work cleaning offices. If you're in the big office corridors of Wisconsin and Connecticut Avenue, back when he started cleaning offices, the crews were all native-born black and Central American. Now they're entirely Central American. And it gave him a particular view of the world, and I think a particular view of the United States that is healthy and instructive for a native-born person who's never had to worry about any of this to hear. And it's good to be reminded of how difficult and complicated this all can be.
Mr. Suarez, so I haven't done the research on that, but I did actually, I listened to NPR, and then one of the things they saying that immigrant communities themselves, some I guess, are don't want open borders. They are for close the borders, right, deport. So what are you hearing? I mean, you kind of like, aren't those immigrant communities are the ones who actually know that there's enough space for more people, right? That there are enough jobs for everybody. What are you hearing from those communities? What are they afraid? What are they kind of attuned to?
I think immigrant communities have heard, like the community at large, that there is chaos, a completely wide open border that people can just rush across from everywhere in the world, that we don't know who people are or where they're from. These are all things that are not true. But certainly in immigrant communities, they're getting some of the same kind of information, and they repeat some of these same phrases. They say, oh, I don't want open borders. I don't want a completely open country. They think it's disordered, it's chaotic, that unlimited people are coming in. All these things are not true. I think there is a very purposeful tendency on one side of the debate to make it sound like the system is totally out of control and unable to do any work. When people talk about, somebody talked to me about more than 30 million people being here out of status. So I said, oh, you mean to tell me that a number of people equivalent to the entire population of Texas is in this country illegally? Yes. So that if we walk out on the street, 1 out of every 3 people we run across, or 1 out of every 4 people we run across, is going to be here illegally. Yes. There are people who believe that. Steve Bannon said the other day, there may be 50 million people here illegally in the country. I would submit to you that if a number of people equivalent to the population of Florida and Texas was here illegally, we'd know. And we wouldn't just know when we went to a restaurant. We'd know. And it's kind of silly. And given the workforce participation rates of people who are newly arrived in the country, it might not be such a bad thing. They are working very hard. They're adding a lot to the GDP of the country. They're making marginally profitable businesses profitable. They are keeping us fed, keeping our chickens and pigs killed, turning chickens into breasts and wings and thighs, and pigs into bacon and pork chops. And everybody who's eating a pork chop doesn't seem to mind. If they went to the processing plants in northwest Arkansas and western Iowa and the Dakotas, they would see an almost entirely immigrant workforce making their food. And one of the reasons why it doesn't cost twice as much to buy a pork chop is because of those people. Yes, it's true, especially among Latinos who have the most extensive ethnic press of any large immigrant group in the country. Spanish speakers can watch 2 television networks, they have newspapers, scads of radio stations. They have a complete media smorgasbord. And what you hear on those sources of information sometimes is really, really wrong. It's just incorrect. But it creates an impression in the country, an impression that is widely held. And, to be a little less generous to them, there's also a pull up the ladder behind me mentality among some of them. Not all of them, by far, but the idea that if I've just gotten through this door, I just made it through the door, the thing that I want to do now is close the door behind me, which that's always been true. There were Italians saying that no more Italians should come in 1920. There were Irish in 1910 saying, I think there are quite enough Irish here already now. Maybe more shouldn't come. That has been a part of the immigrant story in the United States since 1850, when large numbers of people started coming here. 75 million people came here between 1840 and 1920. It was just a mind-blowing number of people. And they built railroads, and they made steel, and they laid brick, and they built roads, and they did a lot of stuff, and we needed it done, and they did it, and everybody was very satisfied with the deal at the end. And This is just the new era of that. And I don't know why we're having such a hard time with it. It may be that out of all the countries that send people here, if you look at the list of the birth countries of immigrants to the United States in 1870, they were almost all white. If you look at the list of birth countries in the last census, in the 2020 census, with the exception of Canada, all of them are sending non-white immigrants to the United States, and that may be part of this. If you look at a map and where there are those concentrations, they are mostly not places where there are also large immigrant populations. So when I was on the Crow Reservation in Montana early last year, nobody there was really worried about the border. Of all the things they had to worry about joblessness, they had to worry about opioid addiction, they were worried about a lot of things, keeping their kids in high school and all that. Nobody mentioned the border or immigration, and not a lot of immigrants are going to Montana. I was in New Mexico late last year, and while in Albuquerque there are immigrants, certainly, once you get north of Albuquerque into the great big vast empty stretches of New Mexico, where there are a good dozen reservations and people who have lived there since no one can even know exactly when they got there, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, it's hard to say. They weren't really talking about the border or those. It just happens to work out. I mean, even in much more crowded New York State, the reservation land is up near the Canadian border, which is the least populated part of New York State, which is one of the largest states in the Union. So they have maybe a philosophical idea about it. They maybe have an abstract idea about it, but they're not competing with immigrants for jobs. I was in a reservation earlier this year in Washington State, just east of the Cascade Mountains. And there are immigrants moving in. It's mostly their second stop in the country. Mostly Mexicans, small number of Central Americans, moving further north, away from the big metropolises in California for agricultural work. And there, the tribes have been very welcoming to Mexicans arriving in the counties east of the Cascade Mountains. They rent them land, they rent them housing, and there's not really a problem. But in a lot of other places in America, tribes are centered on places where there's not a lot of demand for the land, and there's not a lot of demand for space, and there's not a lot of competition for jobs. So I think they are, if anything, interested in the way other people make their way in the country, but they aren't either advocating for or against immigration, because their problems are so huge. When you're on the reservation, you've got a lot of challenges, and immigration just doesn't register that much. Really on what the president-elect does. His most loyal voters are very, very much in support of a maximalist approach to deportation. Not just picking up a couple of people here and there and sending them home as a demonstration, but a really thorough cleaning out. I think there will be civil disobedience. I think there will be, because a lot of people are going to refuse to leave, there will be violence. And it's going to cost an eye-watering amount of money. We haven't even had a serious conversation about just how much it would cost to deport 10 million people or 5 million people.
So this will force the issue then, because it's been essentially ignored. The issue has been ignored, so this might at least force the issue, as ugly as it might end up being.
I think Trump made it such a strong feature. If you watch the campaign of the last 3 months, the sort of sprint to the finish line, mass deportation featured in almost every speech and was wildly applauded by people who were at the rallies. And there will be a lot of attention on his follow-through, whether he really is going to do it or not. So he may feel that his hand is forced. He proposed the thing. He may not even want to do it by the time January comes around. But he may be forced to do at least some of it to satisfy the hunger for it among his voters. I think for a lot of Americans to whom that seems appealing, they may hear it and say, yeah, people who are breaking the law, we should kick them out. They don't belong here, so they should be sent home to where they come from. I get how simple and straightforward that sounds. But when you actually try to do it, and you have to appropriate hundreds of billions of dollars to do it, if you do it at scale, it's going to drive up labor costs. For a president who is promising to lower inflation, his idea that that we're going to lower inflation and somehow somebody else is going to pick those strawberries, it's an interesting idea. I don't think it's really going to come to pass. I know none of you are going to be out there picking strawberries.
No strawberries for us.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.